Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to answer your listener questions for the month of November 2025. And before we hit record, Justin and I were talking about how there's some kind of interesting themes that have emerged from this month's questions, and some very common types of questions related to a couple of different topics that mineral and royalty owners face at different points in the life cycle of owning these types of assets, which I thought was interesting, Justin.
Yeah, you said it, Matt, and that seems to be the name of the game with minerals. Is you're really trying to figure this information out as it comes your way. And if it's the first time you've handled it, it creates a lot of questions. So not uncommon at all.
Yeah. So this first question here I thought was pretty interesting, and it was from Roy. And Roy asks, when will the Permian be depleted and what happens? And he put a quote in here, I think, with some figures from the Pioneer Natural Resources investor presentation from 2023 before Exxon acquired Pioneer. And he had some different things about the number of years of high return inventory. But Justin, what's your take on Permian oil and gas reserves, and how much longer do we have out there?
Matt, I don't think that we have to worry anytime soon. So there's a lot of information, Matt, that you've put together, and it really goes into some real details. So the Permian tight oil reserves are estimated to be about 15 billion barrels. The Texas counties in the Permian Basin produce over 4.1 million barrels per day in the fourth quarter of 2023, now up to over 6 million barrels per day total for the greater Permian Basin. So, Matt, with looking at some of the figures that are out there, 10 years of proved reserves, 7 years at increased reserves, we're not going anywhere fast when it comes to that. And Matt, the history, which you can speak to this more than I can, the history of the industry has always been that the exploration goes deeper, we find more formations, and that is kind of the name of the game.
Yeah, and that's been a hot topic for the past, I would say, 50 years, where this concept of peak oil. And so there was all these prognostications back in, before 2000s, and certainly before the shale revolution, about when we would achieve peak oil and when oil production would start to decline and never recover. Of course, we never reached peak oil because there was new discoveries and new technologies, to your point, Justin, where we find a way to drill deeper, to drill horizontally, to combine that with hydraulic fracturing, and that just unlocked a whole new world in terms of oil and gas reserves. And so that extended the runway for that peak oil discussion for decades. Now that we're in this position that we're in now, where every year I feel like, in the Permian in particular, to your question, Roy, seeing new production records and new peak, daily production rates. And like Justin mentioned, just the Texas side of the Permian, and at the end of 2023 was producing over 4.1 million barrels per day. The total Permian, including the New Mexico side, is up to over 6 million barrels per day. And so those proved reserves numbers, I think, were from probably at this point about 7-ish years ago. And so they're probably much higher than what they were. But just saying that, if we assume that there's 15 billion barrels of economic, and so we say proved reserves, that implies that they are economic at today's prices and with the current technology. And just with that alone, we'd be looking at around 7 years at that 6 million barrels per day mark. And so it doesn't seem like a lot of time, but that is also assuming that, there are no new discoveries, no new booking of additional reserves and things like that. So I think that is going to continue to get pushed out as the expansion of the drilling activity widens out of the core area within the Permian Basin, which we consider the core right now, because ultimately operators aren't going to be booking that, and we're not going to be considering it proved reserves until we get close enough to drill those. And so by definition, the SEC requires that operators are going to go and drill any proved reserves within the next 5 years. They have to have that in their plans in order to book those and to have them on the balance sheet. So, I see that just continually expanding and continually getting pushed out as we expand the drilling, because there's a ton of white space or undrilled acreage within the Permian still. I think that is economic certainly at like above $60 a barrel. And then when you look at the geologic, assessment of oil and gas that's in place, and what the USGS does when they do these assessments of like the Permian Basin in this case, they take a look at what's technically recoverable at current technology, irregardless if it were economic or not. So it's assuming that you could technically go in with technology available today and go and drill and produce that oil. Whether it's economic or not is a totally different discussion, and that's where that proved reserves discussion comes in, because that by definition has to be economic to produce. So all oil and gas in place based on the latest USGS assessment, I think it was 2018, was 46.3 billion barrels of oil and 281 trillion cubic feet of gas in the Wolfcamp Shale and Bone Spring in the Delaware Basin. Okay, so that is basically the west side of the Permian Basin into New Mexico. That is 31 years at current production rates. And that doesn't even include like the eastern half of the Permian, the Midland Basin, basically. So all of that to say is that we've got decades, probably centuries left of oil production. I don't know. The final answer is I don't know when the Permian will be depleted, but I expect that it would be not in our lifetime. I would expect that it may be in our kids' lifetime or our grandkids' lifetime, they would start to see a decline and decrease. And certainly you'll see production from the Permian for years to come, for decades, for sure. And all of this assumes that this is just primary recovery. And when I say that, I mean that, we drill a well, we put it on artificial lift, like with a pump jack or whatever, and we let it produce until it stops producing economically, and then we plug it and abandon it. It doesn't account for any new technologies that come along that allow us to recomplete those wells or refrac those wells, or to use what's called enhanced oil recovery, like gas injection, chemical treatments, CO2 floods, and things like that, which hasn't really been done in these unconventional shale wells yet. There's been some recompletions. I think the Bakken is kind of one area that you're seeing start a lot of that, or kind of be the leader in that area. But ultimately, when we recover oil and gas from a well, we're only really getting about 5 to 10% of the oil, or about 20% of the gas. And what that means is that there's 90% of the oil is left underground. We know it's there. We just have to find the technology and a way to get it out of the ground. So if you figured that we were able to go in and recomplete these wells and extract another 10% of the oil, that's basically doubling all of the production in the history of mankind that's happened up until this point, and that would be out in the future that we'd have that ability. So if you think about, we've been producing oil and gas for, 130, 140 or 150 years, we would see that another, 100 plus years of oil and gas production from these very prolific reservoirs, like in areas like the Permian Basin. So I would say it's not out of the realm of possibility that we have another, say 100 or 125 years of production in the Permian, again, based on new technologies coming along, refracking, enhanced oil recovery, getting all of the oil and gas that we know is in the ground to get incremental 10% out. And then who knows, by the end of that time period, we'll probably have another way to get another incremental 10% out. So I think the moral of the story here is we have a lot of time ahead of us in terms of oil and gas potential and oil and gas production in the Permian Basin.
You said it, Matt. And I think it can be confusing to mineral owners when they're hearing these different perspectives from different folks, because as you mentioned with the CEO of Pioneer, he's really talking about proved reserves, and that really is a very different measurement than what the USGS is doing. And so it's easy to get confused there, and I can see how, without understanding the difference, how that could be concerning. But like you said, Matt, the technology has always improved, and I'm sure it will continue to get better. So many more years to come. The next one's from Nancy here. And Nancy says, just found out we may own more mineral rights in our Ohio land. And Nancy is considering taking a look at Matt's online course to learn more about minerals. But in the meantime, her accountant is wanting to know the formula for estimating value at the time of inheritance. And Matt, this is another very common question for mineral owners, because you certainly don't want to pay from zero to whatever the property is currently worth. And so a step up in cost basis is what's typically done there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, Nancy, there isn't really a formula. You can just plug in the year and, the acreage and get a number. It's very dependent on the location and the oil and gas activity and what would have been going on at the time of inheritance. And so when we do an appraisal, what we call a look back appraisal, like Justin said, to establish a step up in cost basis, we're basically going back in the time machine, so to speak, and looking at the wells that existed as of the date of death or the alternate valuation date. And then we say, okay, what was known or knowable as of that date in terms of technology and, activity levels and permits. And so you have to look at, what wells would have been permitted at that point and, what technology, what are the current rates? Is it likely that wells would have been drilled in the next 5 years as of that date? And all of that goes into an actual discounted cash flow analysis. And we basically look at any existing wells and do a forecast on production from those existing wells and then estimate any future wells. And unfortunately, what happens is if you had inherited mineral rights prior to, I would say around 2010 or so, where the advent of horizontal drilling combined with hydraulic fracturing really unlocked a lot of these new plays, your value is generally not going to be super high because it would have been more conventional oil and gas. It would have been more hit or miss, vertical wells, a lot lower production rates. And so, yeah, unfortunately, Nancy, there's not really a tried and true way. You can get a very high level estimate of the producing wells based on a multiple of cash flow. So you could do, if those wells had existed and been producing for more than 5 years, you could probably do between say 50 to 60 months average monthly royalty to figure out what the value of those producing reserves are. But then as far as it wouldn't put any value on the undeveloped acreage. And at that time, if there was a likelihood of new drilling, it would be too low of a number to be defensible if you were to get audited by the IRS. So you really need to get a professional appraisal. And so that is something we actually talked with Rob Prentice on the show a couple of times, but on episode 32, where he talks about those IRS mineral rights valuations, what's involved. And that is something that I do for clients. If you do need an appraisal, reach out. But, that's something that, again, it's not inexpensive, I will say, because it is very time consuming. The reports are, 40 to 50 pages long with all kinds of maps and figures and has all the data in there so that if you were to get audited, someone could independently confirm and come up with approximately the same value that the appraisal, shows. And so that you could defend your justify what you're saying the cost basis was at the time of inheritance. So hopefully that helps. But it's one of those things that is unfortunately kind of like a black art right now still.
Yeah, unfortunately, Matt, it's a tricky one, which there are some folks in the industry trying to solve that with technology. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the coming years. Okay, next one, Matt, is from Donna. Donna says, my sister and I are mineral owners. We would like help with learning the process and timeline from the time a location is permitted until it hopefully becomes a producing well. She says we have several permitted locations on our mineral rights and that she doesn't have surface rights, but there's a drilling and producing wells all around them. Matt, and another very common question for mineral owners. We have episode 15. They're going to drill on my land. How long before I start getting paid oil and gas royalties? And this is a great one, Matt, for the perspective of the mineral owner who's curious what it's going to take and how long they might expect. And then if you're looking for more about the actual drilling and the well planning and what's going to happen, episode 176, we have a behind the scenes well planning where we kind of talk about the inner workings and what they're doing at that time.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Donna. And Donna doesn't mention which part of the country she owns minerals in, but you're in certainly a good spot if you're having a lot of drilling occurring near you. And so I think with those permits that showed up, that does show line of sight to drilling. And what I would expect is that, like Justin said, you can look at all the steps that are involved before the well is actually spud, which means basically when the well starts to be drilled, that well planning process. And that can take years in some cases, depending on the regulatory requirements and all the hoops that the operator has to jump through and the permits and the environmental reviews and all those kinds of things. But, once they permit the well, I think it's pretty safe to assume, a possible scenario is that they're going to drill that well before the permit expires. Now, that's possible it doesn't get drilled, but nowadays, if they're going to go to the trouble of permitting a well, it's more than likely it's going to get drilled, or at least some of those wells that are permitted are going to get drilled. And so if you want to figure out when, you can say, let's say that well was permitted in November of 2025 when we're recording this, and it's a 2-year expiration. So the permit expires in November of 2027. The way I would look at it would be that, worst case scenario, they spud that well on November 1st, 2027. And then from there, you want to figure out how long it's going to take for them to drill and then complete it. And if everything goes according to plan and fairly quickly through each step of the drilling and completions process, I would expect, say, 3 to 4 weeks from when they spud the well to when it's done being drilled. And then, best case, they bring a completions crew back to the well pad to frack the well right away. And if they do that, then, again, you're looking at another, let's say, 3 weeks or so. More than likely, they'll frack all of those wells simultaneously or do them in order. And so that's usually about a week, let's say, per well. If you had 4 wells, that'd be about a month to frack all of those wells. And then they have to start flow back, and that takes a certain period of time. And then they put that on production and start selling the oil and gas after they remove the sand and all of the stuff from the completions process. So again, best case scenario, you're probably looking at, let's say, 3 to 6 months after they spud the well to when it's starting to produce. And then, again, you can add another 6 months from that be the latest that you would start to see royalties. So again, just I think for a pretty safe number, about a year after the well is drilled from when you would start to get royalties at the worst case. Hopefully it'd be a lot sooner than that. But, in some cases, they may drill a well and leave it, not complete it right away. That's called a drilled but uncompleted well, or DUC. And in those cases, you could extend that timeline by another year. Let's say if the oil prices weren't good and they wanted to wait until prices recover, they might hold off and let that well sit there. Again, depending on the formation, depending on if that is something that wouldn't decrease the overall oil and gas that well is going to produce over its lifetime, just because of maybe formation damage or other technical reasons. Sometimes they won't do that just because in the formation that wouldn't support that. But in some cases, they will leave it for several months. So just depends. But that's kind of a rough timeline, I would say, between that 6 to 12 month period from when a well is drilled to starting to produce. And again, worst case, from the permit until it becomes a producing well, you would again be looking at, let's say, 2 to 3 years. So big range, I know, but it really just totally depends on the specific situation that you're in. But I think that's kind of a safe bet if you're looking at possible outcomes.
You said it, Matt. And if you're able to figure out who these operators are and confirm your ownership, there, you could certainly reach out to the operator, and they're going to have an idea of when they would like to complete the wells. And that doesn't mean that timelines don't change, but it's certainly a question that you can ask, whether they answered or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's probably the best way to find out, honestly, is just to reach out to the owner relations department, like Justin said, and ask them. And a lot of times they'll tell you, and then you can get a good idea and help you estimated tax purposes. All
right, Matt. So our next one here is interesting. It's much like our first one, but for a different area. So a commenter from YouTube here says, was wondering if the Bakken core is still going to be productive much longer. I know there's been some major company acquisitions in the billions, so I'm assuming there's more production and profitability, but how much might be left in these legacy wells? Matt, this is an interesting question. There's a quote from an article here. It says, the reality is top tier inventory is depleting and oil production is plateauing. Oil production peaked in 2019 and has not recovered to the same level since. Gas production peaked in late 2023, but has plateaued since then. And Matt, I'm sure you can dive into the specifics on this, but both Devon Energy and ConocoPhillips say they have about 10 years of inventory in the Bakken at current activity levels. So, Matt, perhaps it's a case of supply and demand more so than it is that there's just no more oil available.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is a good point. And supply and demand ultimately will dictate the oil price, and that will determine what wells are economic to drill at those prices. And the story is very similar, I think, to the Permian. It's maybe not going to be quite as long of a runway or as much oil there. But then again, we don't have as high production rates out of the Bakken. So that is, kind of something to take into consideration. The one thing that I will say with this article will link to in the show notes is it mentions the merger of Chord Energy and Enerplus last year. That created one of the largest operators in the Bakken. They mention here that Chord's plan is to keep oil production volumes of the merged assets flat on the 2024 levels from 2025 through 2027 with annual capex of $1.4 billion. So in my mind, that indicates that they are bullish enough that they're spending $1.4 billion per year. So, to your question, I think you are looking at there is going to be a lot of productivity from the Bakken core for years to come. And like we mentioned earlier, the Bakken is one area that they have started to do refracs and different things like that. And so they're trying to extend out the life of these existing wells and boost the production from these existing wells. So I do think that is going to continue and probably expand, because from a capital investment point of view, refracking a well is usually a lot more of a lucrative proposition because you've already spent the money to drill the wellbore, and all you're doing is coming back in with the frac crew and refracking. So it's, a fraction of that initial investment that you're having to spend to boost the production. Of course, it just depends on how much oil and gas you expect to get, additionally from that project. But I do think that you'll see the Bakken core continuing to be productive for a lot longer. You see it as probably one of the, say, top 5 most economic basins from an oil perspective. So, as long as there is demand for it and the prices support it, then I would see this type of activity and this type of technology advancing in the Bakken. Now, of course, like Justin alluded to, the supply and demand equation is the big question. If, oil prices were to fall to, say, $30 a barrel, I think you would see the annual capex drop significantly, probably more than half from Chord Energy, for example, and, other operators as well would follow suit. So, again, all this is predicated on oil prices staying, in that, say, $60 plus. The big variable, but, technically recoverable oil and gas, I think, again, you're looking at decades from the Bakken.
You said it, Matt. Yeah. And who knows what technologies will come along. All right. Our next one here is about taxes. So Tom says he enjoyed Matt's course, that he struggled to get a oil and gas accountant or a CPA or bookkeeper who's intimately aware of oil and gas. He said he's involved in both non-op working interest and royalty interest, and has some questions about how to find a bookkeeper, which these are great questions, Matt. So he asked how to find an oil and gas CPA, how to screen, how to check out a CPA. And Matt, this can be a bit tricky because some really have absolutely no idea. Some have a very basic idea from the tax code, and then some really, that's what they do.
Yeah, and that's a good initial question, is really just to ask, I think, how many other clients that they have that have oil and gas assets, and how familiar are they with oil and gas, both bookkeeping, if that's what you need in your case, Tom, or, just certainly on the tax filings and deductions and those types of things. So I think it's really, you almost have to just interview each of the CPA candidates. I think looking at, starting with their websites, talking to other folks and finding out, who they use, other mineral owners in your area, in your state, and things like that. One good resource, I will say, if you're a member of the National Association of Royalty Owners, or NARO, we have a supporter directory. So that's all the companies that have sponsored or advertised at a certain level with NARO. And we have a directory of service providers, and that includes accounting firms and CPAs and things like that. So that would be another great place to start. The good thing about CPAs as well, I will say, doesn't have to necessarily be in the state where you're located. So don't constrain yourself to the city that you're in. Like if you're in Minneapolis, St. Paul, trying to find an oil and gas, a CPA familiar with oil and gas, may be hard. But if you have your CPA and they're in Houston, or if they're in Denver or Oklahoma City, or some of these more active oil and gas areas, they may have other clients that have oil and gas assets. And so they would know how to handle it. And ultimately, filing state income taxes in whatever state you live, pretty much, I think most CPAs can figure that out and do it. The harder thing is to find somebody that's got familiarity with oil and gas assets. So that would be a way to kind of start to screen that. And again, I think just coming up with some list of questions of, hey, do you have other clients that have oil and gas assets? How familiar are you with the percent depletion deduction, the cost depletion deduction? Can you tell me about that? Get them to sort of explain, their understanding of that. And then also with your non-operated working interest, ask them about intangible drilling costs. Say, what do you know about intangible drilling costs and the ability to expense that? Tell me about what you know there. Just trying to gauge their level of knowledge. And then he asked some very specific questions about forms and filing taxes and things like that. I think that's ultimately, if you find somebody that knows about depletion deduction, intangible drilling costs, and then the worksheets specific to that or the forms that they need to fill out, they'll know that and know what needs to be done there. And so my CPA, they do all of that for me. I get a worksheet that shows those calculations and shows that information. I don't know that it's an IRS worksheet. I think it's a proprietary worksheet that they come up with, but then, it's a extension of your Form 1040, depending on how you're filing taxes and all that gets very specific to your situation. If you have a, pass-through LLC or, a single member LLC, or do you have a S Corp or whatever. So it just obviously gets more into the technical stuff that your CPA can help advise you as to the best way to handle it once you get them hired and get up and running there. But we do cover kind of at high level about finding those trusted advisors, CPA being one of them in episode 272, where we talk about taking over mineral management. And then also episode 20, we talk about taxes on mineral rights and royalties. So those two episodes will give you the questions and the types of things to look for so that when you go and start to screen or to interview these CPAs, you can get off on the right foot.
You said it, Matt. And, I think what makes Tom's situation a little bit more tricky than the average bear is most folks are not dealing with non-op working interest, and that adds a whole different layer of knowledge and complexity to things. And something you mentioned, Matt, which is looking for folks who may not be in your local area, that might really be key because you may have to go to areas where oil and gas interests are more routine. I know in my situation, Matt, I live in Colorado, but my minerals are in Texas, and quite often I need to work with folks who are located in Texas or in Midland specifically, because that seems to be where every admin function of the oil and gas industry lives. So, but no, Tom, that it's a little bit of a tricky situation. But once you do find somebody, I hope that they really work out for you and they'll be a good advisor.
Absolutely.
All right, Matt. So next one here is from Mark, and this is something we get quite often. Mark says, I am grateful for your podcast. My wife and I own mineral royalties with 2 vertical wells in Howard County, Texas. And they're using Enverus Energy Link app, and I can see the operator is actively drilling 5 horizontal wells on our property, which is exciting. Perhaps the royalty owners need guidance like we do. Mark attached a photo of inside of the Mineral IQ app and mentioned that he has watched the rig move to 3 of the 5 graphed lines in the past 4 to 5 weeks. He asked in an upcoming episode if we can interpret what the graphic shows. And Matt, this tool used to be called Mineral IQ, and Matt just let me know that it was actually renamed to Energy Link. But this tool allows mineral owners a way to see some information about their wells. They have both a free and a paid plan. And like the State Oil and Gas Commission websites or lookup tools, this shows the laterals, Matt, the take point, where the well pad is, and where that well bore is actually traveling through. They're really great tools, but they're certainly not the source of all wisdom, Matt. And so the plat map is really what you need or want. And I'm sure you can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we'll put a link or put this image in the show notes. If you go to mineralrightspodcast.com and look for this episode, you can find that picture that Mark sent. It's just a screenshot from his phone that shows the map. Basically shows the rig location, shows 5 different wells with lines headed off to the sort of northwest on this picture. But basically, Mark, what this picture that you sent shows is the surface location of those wells, and there's different icons representing the different well status. So, for example, the first well that was drilled is got a status of a duck, right? So it's a gray circle, and it says DUC. So that means it's drilled but uncompleted. And because the rig is there on the well pad, when he sent this screenshot, it's just moving down from one well to the next. They skid the rig over. So basically these wellheads are very close together on the surface, and the wellbores go off in different directions. But the surface location is relatively close so that they call skid the well over, scoot it over to the next well. And so they just basically will drill the first one, scoot it over to the next one, and then keep going down the line until all of the wells are drilled. And so what you're showing, Mark, in this picture is that the rig looks like it's on the second well at this point. The first one's been drilled, and looks like maybe even one of them is on production already. So that might have been an existing well. And then these other 4 are infill wells. So in other words, they held your lease with the first well. Now they're coming back to infill or to fill in the remaining space to start producing oil and gas from the entire unit. So again, there are lots of other tools out there. Energy Link is one of them that shows that map interface, shows the location of the rig. You can get notifications of when wells or new permits show up, and then when wells start producing or when wells are drilled, including wells on your land or within 2 miles, I believe is the query that they run. But yeah, if you want to find out more about that, you can go to the Energy Link website. There's other resources out there. There's some amazing mineral management tools that help automate this and help notify you when rigs show up or when you're missing a royalty payment or whatever. So SS&C Mineralware is another one out there that I recommend. Energy Link is another one that's great. So lots of different resources out there, but that's what you're looking at, Mark. And congrats on the new wells. And I think hopefully by the time you're listening to this, you should have started to receive royalties. So congrats.
You said about it, and it's a neat experience to be able to see those on the map and then actually see them in person. That's not an experience everybody gets to see. All right, Matt. So our last question here is from YouTube, and they say, "Hi, Matt. Is there a way to find out which relative left oil and gas royalties for which payments were made and then stopped? We have the section, township, and range numbers. How do we begin our research here in Oklahoma?" So, Matt, this is a very common question. I know in my experience, at least, it started a snowball. So one thing led to another, and then I learned a lot of information all at once, and then a lot more as I readdressed things. Really, you have to start with the title research in the county where minerals reside. You can hire a local landman, which is somebody who would go do that title research for you. And Matt, do you have any suggestions where to look for a landman?
Yeah, I think going back to that narrow supporter directory, that's probably the first place to start. Again, all different service providers are listed in that directory, including landman. And so if you need somebody to run title, in a state that you don't live in, and maybe they don't have the county records online, that would be a great place to start. Or like Justin mentioned, you can do the research yourself. Do you want to talk a little bit more about running title and kind of where do you get started doing that?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. And so we did an episode 10, so very earlier on, how to perform a title search. And so that would be a great listen to kind of get an idea of what you might be getting yourself into. And if you're interested in going down the process of learning how to do this, Matt's online course is a really great place to start. There's some fundamental knowledge you'll need to build, and it's really great to have something to research at the time that you're doing it so that you can apply that knowledge. But this becomes kind of a snowball, Matt. And if you have a starting point, that'll be kind of where you start. And it's a matter of doing research, depending on the county you're in. And she didn't mention the county, just the state of Oklahoma. You might be able to find some of these records online. Sometimes the counties do them from a certain date forward. Sometimes the counties have the complete records available online. So that helps a lot when that's the case. But if not, it can mean going to the actual county courthouse and going through documents.
Yeah, another great place, Brenda, is in Oklahoma. It's a website called okcountyrecords.com, and they have multiple counties you can search all in one place. And so that's a great place to get going and to search for the name of your ancestors and start to get a feel. But, really to find out who left what, it does require that title search because you have to cross-reference the wells that are producing. And so that would be on the Oklahoma Corporation Commission website, which we'll link to in the show notes. We actually have a video on how to use that website. But you would have to get a list of those wells and find where those wells are located as far as the plat map, like Justin alluded to in the previous question. That'll tell you where the minerals are that the well is producing from. And then you can use that to cross-reference that legal description from that lease or unit where the well is located to where you own minerals. And so you'll have a list of different properties and different legal descriptions for where you own mineral rights that you'll find from your title search. And then you'll have your list of wells, which you'll have to find out where the wells are located from a legal description point of view. And then you can cross-reference those different mineral tracts to the wells, and then you can figure out, based on your research, who left you those minerals and, who owned those at one point in time. So if you had aunts and uncles that maybe have passed these down and you got them from different sides of the family or what have you, you can then figure out, what you got from whom, so to speak. So yeah, it's kind of it does get a little bit involved, having a very thorough documentation helps with this. And so I have in episode 10, a run sheet template that you can download for free that'll allow you to document your title research there. And then coming up with, a single source of the truth as far as where you own interest in wells, starting with an Excel spreadsheet is probably a good place to start, and just listing out, the name of the well, the operator, the surface location, the bottom hole location, as far as the legal descriptions, your net revenue interest, in other words, your decimal interest in each of those wells, and then links to like the Oklahoma Corporation Commission website for those wells, and then copying and downloading all the important documents, which again, I cover in my course, the list of all the important documents you should have, how to run title, how to decipher a legal description and find it on a map, how to use the Corporation Commission website. All of those things are covered in the course. So hopefully that helps, Brenda.
Yep. And good luck on the journey. It's a lot of learning, but it's worth it in the end.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that wraps up this month's listeners' questions. Thanks again for submitting the questions. If you have a question you'd like us to answer in a future episode, you can email it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.